there are several body cavities that are formed within the human body. The thoracic cavity, the abdominal and pelvic cavity, which are actually one continuous cavity, often referred to as the abdominopelvic cavity. There's also the cranial cavity, and there's also the cavity through which your spinal cord runs through the column of vertebrae. The cranial cavity is the hollow portion of the skull. It has a dome top and a base composed of several bones. It houses the brain and is continuous with the spinal cavity, which is also known as the spinal column or vertebral canal. The spinal cavity travels through the vertebrae in the spine and contains the spinal cord. Organs within these cavities are part of the nervous system and special sensory systems. The spinal cord and brain are enclosed in the vertebral column in the skull. The colon is a fluid-filled body cavity that contains organs and connective tissue. It consists of both the thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavity. The muscular diaphragm divides the colon into the thoracic and abdominal cavities. There are several places in your body where serous membranes are formed. Serous membranes are a specialized form of thin connective tissue. Each membrane has two portions. The parietal portion lines the wall of the cavity, where the visceral portion covers the internal organs. One way that I find helpful to remember the difference is oftentimes all of the organs that are contained within the abdominal cavity are referred to as the viscera. So if you think of the organs as the viscera, then it's easy to remember that the membrane that covers the organs or is attached to the organs is the visceral portion of the serous membrane. And the other is the parietal. That's the part that lines the inside of the body cavity. So there's several examples of this. The one that's probably very most important to paramedics is the pleural serous membrane. In the pleural serous membrane, there's the visceral portion covers the lungs, the parietal portion covers the inside of the rib cage, and the space in between is filled with a small amount of fluid known as pleura or pleural fluid. The pleura is the space. So under normal circumstances, this is really a potential space, or a space where a void can exist, but under normal homeostatic conditions, it's relatively empty because the two membranes are pretty much up against each other. Serous membranes secrete fluid that fills the space between the visceral and the parietal membranes. The thoracic cavity is located between the base of the neck and the diaphragm. It's formed by the roughly circular boundary of the rib cage. The major organs of the thoracic cavity include the lungs, the heart, and several major blood vessels, including the descending aorta and the vena cava. The lungs are surrounded by a set of serous membranes called the pleura. The pleura cavity is a space between the visceral and parietal pleura. It's only a potential space. It rarely contains anything other than a small amount of lubricating fluid called the pleural fluid. Trauma or congenital abnormality of the lung can result in a condition known as pneumothorax, and that's where the pleural space is expanded and the lung is collapsed. Pneumothorax is strictly defined as an abnormal accumulation of air within the pleural cavity. A small pneumothorax may not be evident without specialized radiographic studies. It is the patient's symptoms, not the size of the pneumothorax, that really matter. I'm sure that you all have studied in EMT the condition known as tension pneumothorax, which is can often be a fatal condition, and it's very commonly misunderstood by pre-hospital providers, though. We'll talk about this several times during the course of this semester. In a tension pneumothorax, one lung is collapsed, and the lung that, let's see if we can draw it out here a little bit. So, I apologize in advance for my lack of artistic ability, but maybe I can help you understand here a little bit. This is the trunk of the patient and their arms. And we have their trachea coming down. It comes, and we have a lung on each side and the heart in the middle. This is under normal conditions. The diaphragm rests about here. By the way, each lung is in its own sealed compartment. Remember that the membrane next to the lung tissue is the visceral pleura. The membrane over here inside the rib cage is the parietal pleura, and that space in between the two is the pleural space. Well, if the patient, for example, has a penetrating injury on the left side of his chest over here, say a gunshot wound or a stab, and air is allowed to escape, then the air fills up this area, and the amount of lung that's available to carry air is greatly reduced. Really, though, the patient's still okay. This is a simple pneumothorax, or at worst, a hemopneumothorax. However, if this continues, in particular in case of gunshot wound, oftentimes as the bullet enters the chest cavity, the resulting trauma creates a one-way valve in which air is sucked in when the diaphragm contracts down to draw air from outside into the trachea and into the lungs. Then air also comes in through the bullet hole. As that happens, more and more air accumulates on this side of the chest. Remember, these are two sealed spaces for each lung and also for the heart. Well, as time goes on, what happens, let's see. Whew. Sorry for the horrible drawing here. As time goes on, you end up with a condition where now we have this side, there's the insult by bullet on this side of the cavity. This side is completely pressurized with air. And what has happened now is that the capacity of the other lung is diminished, and more importantly, there's now a positive pressure being applied to the heart. This positive pressure being applied to the heart shifts all of the organs of the thoracic cavity to the opposite side of the injury and greatly reduces blood flow back to the right atrium. And when this happens, the patient's cardiac output drops significantly and death follows shortly thereafter. We'll revisit that again in the respiratory chapter, the specific pathophysiology of tension pneumothorax. The mediastinum is the space between the lungs. This is where the heart lies. The trachea also passes through this space, as does the mainstem, right and left mainstem bronchi. Part of the esophagus passes through the mediastinum, and several of the large blood vessels do as well. The heart is surrounded by the pericardium, which is also a serous membrane. There's a visceral pericardium, also known as the endocardium, and a parietal pericardium. The space in between the two portions of the pericardium, once again, is a potential space, and during certain pathophysiologies can build up with fluid or sometimes infectious purulent fluid. When this happens, pressure is applied to the outside of the heart, and the resulting condition is called pericardial tamponade. The pericardium is the set of serous membranes. The pericardial sac is the potential space between the serous membranes. It rarely contains anything other than a small amount of lubricating fluid. The abdominal cavity also has a serous membrane. The serous membrane of the abdominal cavity is known as the peritoneum. There's a visceral peritoneum as well as a parietal peritoneum. The spine and the abdominal wall border the abdominal cavity posteriorly. The abdomen can be divided into 4 quadrants by crossing the umbilicus with imaginary perpendicular lines. The umbilicus is the patient's navel or belly button. The retroperitoneal space is that area posterior to the parietal peritoneum. This space contains the kidneys, the pancreas, the duodenum, and the major blood vessels of the abdominal cavity. These structures are referred to as the retroperitoneal organs. The pelvic cavity is the lower portion of the abdominal area. It's bounded by the pelvic girdle. The strong pelvic bones provide protection for the internal organs located within it, which include the gastrointestinal organs, the reproductive organs, and organs of the urinary system. And that's it for Unit 3.